Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our tropical weather video. Today is June 9th, Sunday, 2024. And today I really want to talk about just the setup for this general hurricane season. We talked about it in the past, but I really want to go over it today and break down what is expected, especially with some new model guidance that is out today that we have from a tweet from Ben Knoll, which I'm going to go over later. And we're also going to compare this year as well to other hurricane seasons to really go over the fact as to why specifically the setup for this hurricane season is really something that we need to watch for. And we've been talking about it for basically as long as we've been talking about it since the beginning of the year. But I think it's especially important to go over now that we're talking about it in June, right? When we're actually now into the hurricane season. So we're going to do that today. But let's first get started with the National Hurricane Center homepage just to kind of see what is going on in terms of tropical weather out there. And right now, we are quiet, and it's actually updated for the 2 p.m. bulletin, and there's still nothing expected over the next 7 days. And in the Pacific, it's also the same case. The Atlantic and the Pacific right now remaining quiet. And let's take a look at a satellite image of the Atlantic too. You can see that there's really not much going on as well. We have the ITCZ in the southern MDR. There's also, in terms of what's going on, lots of dry air, and there's also wind shear too, which you could very clearly see, especially from the action from these upper level clouds. And I will remain the fact until we see the wind shear begin to calm down across the general Atlantic, we probably won't see development. But what you can as well see is also, you can see also a lot of convective activity picking up across the central and western Caribbean. This is associated with the general Central American gyre pattern that we're going to see set up over the next several days in the Caribbean and the Pacific as well. And this will probably be a big part into whether or not we will get development over the next week or two to occur either in the Caribbean or probably more likely somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico. But the pattern is beginning to set up now, although it is very disorganized. And I'll show you on the 850 millibar vorticity pattern. You could see that there is more vorticity now beginning to set up over the general Caribbean area. You could actually see some vorticity right now over Central America, I believe, over Belize. And you can see, though, one, that the vorticity is over Central America. So until that gets out into open waters, obviously we won't see much concentration, but two, as well, it is to be expected that we're seeing vorticity begin to generally set up in this region the way it is as part of our Central American gyre pattern. But obviously it really depends whether or not this actually moves into open water and we're actually able to see this vorticity concentrate and also strengthen as well. And that will then lead to whether or not we'll actually get a system to form out of this pattern. But it is beginning to set up, and we'll have to watch it over the next week or so to see what exactly it does. But moving away from that now talking about what indeed is actually happening in terms of our general scope in terms of the Atlantic, but also on a global view, because I really want to show it in terms of the perspective, not just in the Atlantic, but also all the global factors that go into watching the Atlantic as well. And I think the biggest thing, and I really like to bring up this map too, because it not just only shows the general Western Atlantic, but it also shows the whole Northern Atlantic too, which I think is, especially for what we're talking about today, is very important. And you could see in the Atlantic very warm sea surface temperature anomalies throughout the MDR, especially throughout the entire Caribbean and Gulf as well. But really notice too, in the subtropics, on the other hand, you also see the concentration of these colder anomalies as well. We talk about how this is a really favorable pattern because this helps concentrate all of the deep tropical energy in the deep tropics. All of the warm water is in the deep tropics instead of it being all stretched out across the entire basin, and that kind of stretches out where all the rising motion is, and that kind of, it tends to make things a little bit wonky, if you will, if that's the best way to describe it, in terms of what the pattern is in the Atlantic. So it's really ideal that we have all of the deep tropical, all of the energy concentrated in terms of the ocean to the deep tropics. And it's also, I'll show you here in a moment, it actually correlates, this kind of pattern that we have, it really correlates to some of the most active hurricane seasons that we tend to get. And you could also see it even in the North Atlantic too, all this very warm water just south of Greenland, and then on top of that, cold water in the subtropics, and then on top of that, warm water in the deep tropics. Some sort of tripole develops there. And then in the Pacific as well, colder anomalies along the equatorial Pacific associated with neutral to La Nina conditions that are expected this year. And also very important, really important, and I feel like it should be mentioned more, this colder area that we have off the southwest coast of the United States and the Baja Peninsula too. This does actually go hand in hand somewhat with ENSO or La Nina. It's part of the PDO, and it's actually kind of neat to see it. It's very similar to the Atlantic because we call this general signature, we call it part of the AMO, the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. And right now we're in a very positive phase, especially because of how warm the Atlantic is. So positive AMO means very warm Atlantic. And basically the same thing here applies to the Pacific too. We have this colder stretch that goes all the way up from the northern Pacific down and is reflected in the tropical Pacific, basically off the Baja Peninsula. This is part of the PDO, and it's very neat to see how the Atlantic is very warm, very, very warm, and then on the other hand, the Pacific is cold. Very interesting dynamics, and they definitely go hand in hand. And really quickly, just to kind of bring on about the Atlantic, you notice, and this is from a tweet from Philip Klotzbach, and this is from May, and this is interestingly from May, and we're still able to apply it to June. In fact, actually, exactly 1 month ago, he made this tweet. But Philip Klotzbach mentions from May the current Atlantic sea surface temperature pattern matches up almost perfectly with the May sea surface temperature pattern historically associated with busy hurricane seasons. And then that's what this map is. It's the correlation with seasonal ACE. So the highest ACE seasons that we have in the Atlantic, this is what their general sea surface temperature pattern is. And this is what you notice. We have, like this year, so go back to the map this year, we have this horseshoe kind of shape in terms of our warmest sea surface temperatures that stretch all the way down from Greenland into the Atlantic. And this is what we have in terms of what we typically see in a hurricane, in a very active hurricane season too. So you could generally put those two together and you make the comparison, and it obviously lines up with the potential that this season could be very active. And not only that, we have the correlation and we also have the comparison to this year, but how can we correlate that to actual years in the past where we've had an active hurricane season? So let's actually do that now. Starting off though with 2005, obviously we all know how 2005 went, and let's go back to this map really quickly. Very warm sea surface temperatures near Greenland, and then down into the Canary Current off northwestern Africa, and then into the MDR. That's what we generally want to look for in terms of a very active pattern. How does that look in 2005? Yeah, exactly. Picture perfect, really. Very cold subtropics, very warm MDR, and then very warm farther north, far northern Atlantic, indeed. And then also very interesting, look at how it compares to this year. We're very much ahead of 2005 in terms of sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic, but also notice the signature too in comparison to 2005 and 2024. They both have that signature look that we're looking at in terms of a warm northern Atlantic, colder subtropics, and then warm tropical Atlantic. You can see from both years, 2024 and 2005, that both of these years fit into that sort of picture. And then also notice, very interestingly, in the Pacific too, compare that to 2005 as well. Also, we seem to kind of see a pattern as well, and I'll show you in the more years that we go along, you'll start to notice that the Pacific as well, we kind of begin to see a pattern develop as well in terms of the Pacific too. So watch out for that. Let's take it back though, a year though, before 2005, 2004, another infamous year that we also tend to look at a lot. That year, we all remember lots of impacts in Florida. When we had Ivan, we had Francis, Gene, Charlie especially. I think Charlie is the most memorable storm from '04. And notice what this year had. Honestly, really doesn't line up as well as we tend to see with the sort of correlation that we get in terms of these really active seasons. But I think it really comes from the portion off northwestern Africa, which I guess correlates to the strongest from 2004. But ready, watch as I compare this year to 2004. So this is this year, and then look again at 2004. I mean, it's not even close, especially in the MDR. Maybe if we want to look at the similarities in terms of the pattern, in terms of how warm the Canary Current is, maybe that is somewhat comparable to 2004. But I mean, in the MDR, man, it's not close. Look at how, and this honestly goes to show sometimes we don't even need record warm sea surface temperatures to produce a really active hurricane season. I think everybody is really set on the fact that this year will be hyperactive, crazy active because of how warm the Atlantic is. But just look at 2004, and we barely had a warm deep tropics that year, and look at the year that it yielded us. It's very crazy. And just look at it, look at comparing it again to this year, it's not even close. But once again, pay attention to the tropical Pacific as well. Notice that part too, compared to 2024 to that year in '04. Notice that part of the Pacific as well is cold. Although in general, ENSO wise, we're not really that similar to '04, since '04 we got a El Nino Madoki. So we got some sort of El Nino, but it was a Madoki Nino. It was a very weird setup that year, but ENSO wise, it was still an El Nino, and that is definitely not incomparable to this year, in which we're expecting a La Nina. So we have '04. What about now, the next year, 2010? And this is also actually a very comparable year. A lot of people are actually using 2010 to compare this year to, in terms of generally the pattern. We have La Nina setting up, although you could see from 2010 to 2024, it definitely seems like 2010 is ahead in terms of its La Nina development. But especially look at the Atlantic. Even this year, we're warmer. And keep in mind, it's significant because in 2010, that was actually considered record warm. Back then in 2010, this was considered record warm in terms of sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic. And we're even warmer than that this year. That's '05, but here's this year. We're even warmer than that. And also look as well in terms of the pattern we have in the Atlantic in 20 this year, warm over warm, and look at 2010 as well, also warm over cold over warm. And just goes to show just how comparable we are to years like 2010, which was very active, and it's arguably once again the most comparable year to this year. And notice in the Pacific too, once again, colder Pacific, not just in terms of ENSO, but in terms of off the coast of the United States along the Pacific as well. So there's 2010, another year to compare to. What about 2017? 2017 is a very notable year because obviously, one, it's a very recent year, and two, we had notable storms like Harvey, Irma, Maria. 2017, definitely one of those memorable years. And even in the Atlantic this year, just take a look at how it looks between 2017 and this year. Even in the Atlantic, we're not even close in 2017 in terms of how warm it is in the Atlantic. We're far ahead this year than 2017 was. Maybe this year also is more comparable to 2017 in terms of its general setup. We also had a slightly warmer Canary Current right off the northwestern coast of Africa, very much similar to the correlation that we tend to look at. We also look at at this portion that's we call it the Canary Current because that's where it is, near the Canary Islands, off the northwest coast of Africa. That's also majorly a part of the correlation in terms of very active hurricane seasons. Maybe we got a little bit more of that this year, at least as it compares to 2017, but in everything else, it's not even close. Once again, just incredible how much different we are in 2017 in the Atlantic compared to this year. And then once again, very interestingly enough, and it's also present this year, notice how off the coast, this is 2010, here's in 2017, notice how off the Baja Peninsula in the Pacific, once again, we're colder there too. So there's definitely a pattern. If you haven't noticed by now, there's definitely a noticeable pattern in terms of the Pacific being colder, not just in terms of ENSO state, but in terms of the actual Pacific itself, and probably correlations to the hurricane season too. And there's a whole mechanism behind it, and there is indeed some sort of correlation that people actually take into consideration with this sort of SST pattern in the Pacific. But it's in general just very interesting to note that that is something that we also have this year that we should also pay attention to as well when it comes to comparing these active hurricane seasons. And then finally, after 2017, we have 2020. And obviously, we know how 2020 went. 30 named storms, really active, record breaking hurricane season. And look at the Atlantic, even in comparison to 2020, that's '05 once again. Here's this year, compared to 2020, we're not even close. It's insane, really. And also this year as well, had a developing La Nina. And even in 2020, the Pacific wasn't as cold there. And we still had a crazy year in terms of activity. And even then, compared to the setup in 2020, we had that warm over cold over warm look. Most of the energy, at least right now in 2020, concentrated in the deep tropics. Very much the hallmark of an active hurricane season, and compare that to how it looks this year. They line up pretty well in terms of that sort of look, but at least in terms of if you're looking at it in terms of energy in the Atlantic, we're definitely nowhere near, or at least 2020 is nowhere near the level that we are this year. And it's quite incredible to say that if we were able to get this set up in 2020, and it also looks very similar to 2024 if you compare it, but the only difference is that this year it's on a whole completely different magnitude in terms of sheer warmth, and we were able to get this to produce a 30 name storm year. I always beg the question, then what in the heck will this year be if this year is way warmer in terms of pattern wise in 2020? It's definitely fascinating and definitely something that we'll have to see happen in terms of how it happens over the next several months of the season. And speaking of 2020, since that's really the most comparable year we could look at right now, here's a tweet from Ben Knoll, and he compares the European rainfall to what we were in terms of the predictions this time, not last year, but in 2020. Kind of, kind of a segue, since we were just comparing this year to 2020 in terms of sea surface temperature patterns. Now, what about the actual predictions from the models, like the European from 2020 to 2024? And he mentions, once again, 2024, at least in the models, is on another level, just like the sea surface temperatures that we just compared from 2020 to 2024, in terms of favorability for activity in the tropics. He mentions that 2024 is on another level. And he also mentions 2024 is unique. And then he also mentions as well, and this is probably important, that long range model forecasts can and will change. And he does mention, I think this is also important too, that the forecasts leading up to 2020 became more active in time. While I think in comparison this year, a lot of the forecasts right off the gate since December, and we've been talking about it. And you could even take a look back at the channel, going back to videos from December and even January. All the forecasts were extremely aggressive on this season. And just to put it into perspective, what he's showing, this year you could definitely see on a whole other level. This is in terms of precipitation anomalies by the European, and we actually just looked at this several days ago. But here it is. All these greens, all of this represents wetter conditions, more precipitation being shown in the models. And look where all that is. Right in the deep tropics, right across the entire general deep tropical Atlantic. Not just the MDR and the Caribbean, but even through portions of the Gulf and even the southwest coast as well. This is all in the wet category as forecasted by the European in terms of precipitation anomalies. And in general, as I've said before, this is probably as favorable as it gets in terms of precipitation pattern, in terms of if you're looking for an active hurricane season. This just gives it all away. But then compare that to what we had in 2020. If this is what the models had for a 30 name storm year, and I guess you could kind of make the point that Ben Knoll does mention that things did turn more active in time as we went further into 2020. But if this is what the forecast was for a 30 name storm year, um, quite incredible to compare that in comparison to this year, where at least in terms of precipitation anomalies, the favorability quite literally looks um, twice the twice the favorability that we had in a year like 2020 that produced 30 name storms. Just something to keep in mind, and it definitely hammers in the idea that we have a pretty concerning setup, if you ask me, if you're talking about the potential that this year could be very active. And it's reflected in all the forecasts, that's for sure. And there's a reason why everybody is going very, very active on this hurricane season, and there's generally no wavering from that idea. It's all because of all these climate models all showing the exact same thing, that we will have very favorable precipitation anomalies all throughout the deep tropics during the peak season, and starting right now as well, on top of the fact that other factors like La Nina and definitely warmth in the Atlantic just lines up perfectly. Once again, it just goes into the idea of a very concerning setup for this hurricane season. And we'll have to see once again how it pans out. But I'm sure, especially once conditions become more favorable, even though they're iffy right now, and we're still iffy when, I should say, not whether, but more like when we'll get our first named storm. That's still up in the air right now, but I'm definitely telling you for sure, when we get our first named storm, we'll probably that's when we'll probably see the season really take off, because I'm pretty sure once conditions become favorable, I'm pretty sure anything that will probably try to take advantage of these conditions probably will. It just looks like that kind of year, but of course, we'll see. With that being said, though, I'm going to end it off here. Once again, we're going to watch the Caribbean and Gulf to see if there is any sort of development that occurs over the next week or so. Models are still inconsistent with it, although we'll go over the models tomorrow and see if there's any sort of more coherence in terms of what they show. But as for right now, they're still a little bit iffy. Obviously, though, as I did mention before, these Central American gyres, I'm not sure I mentioned this before, but it is important to mention that these Central American gyre setups, where we have a very broad area of vorticity in the Caribbean, the models tend to be a complete headache. So we'll have to see just how that fares out over the next week or so. But either way, heavy rains, gusty winds probably all throughout the Caribbean and also the Southeast as well will probably come out of this, whether or not we do actually get development to occur from the system. With that being said, though, I'm going to end it off here. Stay safe. If you like what you saw today, I always encourage you, like, comment, subscribe, share with family and friends as well. Get the word out about this season, and get the word out about what to watch for. Share your thoughts in the comments as well. If you have any questions, I'll definitely try to respond as quickly as possible. Stay safe. Have a blessed day, a safe one as well. Peace, love, and kindness to you all, and we'll talk again tomorrow.